The Aleutian Islands are some of the most remote, hostile, and easily forgotten places on Earth. Stretching like a broken chain between Alaska and Russia, they are battered by relentless winds, freezing rain, and thick, blinding fog that can swallow entire fleets without warning. During World War II, most people assumed that nothing of real importance could happen in such a desolate corner of the world, but that assumption would prove dangerously wrong. In 1942, while global attention was fixed on massive battles in Europe and the Pacific, Japan made a surprising and bold move. Instead of focusing only on major targets, they pushed north, launching an operation to seize parts of the Aleutian Islands. It seemed almost pointless at first. Why invade barren, fog-covered islands with no major cities, no infrastructure, and barely any population? But behind this decision was a calculated strategy. The islands offered something far more valuable than land: position. From the Aleutians, Japan could potentially threaten the American mainland, disrupt supply lines, and force the United States to divert precious resources away from other critical fronts. It was not just an invasion, it was a distraction, a psychological move, and a test of American response all at once. When Japanese forces landed on islands like Attu and Kiska, the United States was caught off guard. This was the first time since the War of 1812 that American soil had been occupied by a foreign enemy. Even though these islands were remote, the symbolic impact was enormous. Suddenly, the war felt closer to home. But fighting in the Aleutians was unlike anything either side had experienced before. Soldiers weren't just battling each other, they were battling the environment itself. Temperatures dropped to near freezing levels even in summer. Thick fog rolled in without warning, reducing visibility to almost zero. Equipment failed. Navigation became a nightmare. Planes crashed not because of enemy fire, but because pilots simply couldn't see where they were going. American forces quickly realized that this would not be a conventional campaign. There would be no fast advances, no clear front lines, and no easy victories. Instead, everything moved slowly, cautiously, and often blindly. Patrols would disappear into the mist, ships would struggle to maintain formation, communication broke down constantly. Despite these challenges, the United States began organizing a response. The goal was clear: isolate and eliminate the Japanese presence on these islands. To do that, they needed to cut off any chance of reinforcement or escape. A naval blockade would be essential. The idea was simple in theory: surround the islands with ships, monitor every possible route, use aircraft to patrol the skies and detect any movement. If done correctly, it would trap the Japanese forces completely, leaving them with no choice but to surrender or face destruction. But there was a problem. Nothing in the Aleutians was ever simple. Fog could hide entire fleets, storms could scatter ships, radios could fail at the worst possible moment. Even when everything seemed under control, uncertainty was always just one weather shift away. The Americans were trying to build a perfect net in a place where the environment itself kept tearing holes in it. Meanwhile, the Japanese forces on the islands were not passive. They understood the terrain. They adapted quickly. They used the fog as cover, moved carefully, and avoided unnecessary exposure. Every action was deliberate. Every movement was calculated. As weeks turned into months, tension began to build. American commanders believed they were tightening their control, slowly closing in on an enemy that had nowhere left to go. Reports suggested that Japanese troops were isolated, low on supplies, and running out of options. Everything pointed toward an inevitable conclusion. And yet, beneath that confidence, something didn't quite add up. There were gaps in observations, moments where visibility dropped completely, hours where no one could confirm what was happening on the ground or at sea. Small inconsistencies that were easy to dismiss at first, but would later become impossible to ignore. because what seemed like a straightforward operation was quietly turning into one of the strangest and most mysterious episodes of the entire war. And no one at that moment had any idea just how unbelievable it was about to become. By the time American forces fully committed to retaking the Aleutian Islands, the strategy had become clear. Isolate the enemy, cut off every possible escape route, and slowly tighten control until surrender was the only option left. The focus shifted toward one key objective: building a naval blockade so tight that no ship, no submarine, and no aircraft could slip through unnoticed. On paper, the plan was nearly flawless. The United States Navy deployed warships across the surrounding waters, forming a defensive ring around the occupied islands. Patrol routes were carefully mapped out. Destroyers scanned the seas for movement. Larger vessels maintained distance while still covering key approaches. Every possible route that Japanese forces could use, north, south, east, or west, was being watched. Above them, aircraft added another layer of surveillance. Reconnaissance planes flew repeated missions, searching for any sign of activity. Pilots scanned the ocean for wakes, shadows, or even slight disturbances in the water that could indicate a vessel below. In clear conditions, nothing could move without being seen. At least that was the expectation. American commanders grew increasingly confident. Reports indicated that Japanese forces on the islands were effectively cut off. Supplies were running low. Reinforcements were nowhere to be seen. The blockade appeared to be working exactly as intended. It was only a matter of time before the situation collapsed for the trapped troops. But the Aleutians had a way of rewriting every assumption. The same skies that allowed for surveillance could close in within minutes. Thick fog would roll across the ocean like a living wall, swallowing visibility entirely. Pilots who had clear views just moments before suddenly found themselves flying blind. Ships that were in constant radio contact could vanish into the mist, their positions uncertain even to allies. And in those moments, those gaps, control slipped. The U.S. Navy tried to compensate. Patrols were increased, communication protocols were tightened, crews were instructed to remain alert at all times. But even with these precautions, there were limits to what could be controlled. Radar technology at the time was still developing, and in the chaotic conditions of the Aleutians, it wasn't always reliable. False readings were common. Signals could be distorted or lost entirely. What made the situation even more complex was the unpredictability of the ocean itself. Strong currents, sudden storms, and freezing temperatures made operations exhausting and dangerous. Crews were constantly on edge, fighting not just an unseen enemy, but the environment around them. Despite all of this, the official picture remained optimistic. Intelligence reports continued to suggest that the Japanese had no viable way out. Any attempt to escape would require coordination, timing, and luck on a level that seemed almost impossible. Moving thousands of troops across open water under the watch of a naval blockade and aerial patrols should have been unthinkable. And yet, there were subtle signs that something wasn't quite right. Occasionally, patrols would report unusual sounds, distant engines that couldn't be located. Pilots would catch glimpses of shadows through breaks in the fog, only to lose them seconds later. Some crews began to feel that they were not seeing the full picture, that something might be moving just beyond their reach. These reports were often dismissed. In such extreme conditions, it was easy to mistake natural phenomena for enemy activity. Fog could create illusions, sound could travel in strange ways over cold water, fatigue could play tricks on the mind. Still, the unease lingered, because if even a small gap existed in the blockade, if even one route was not fully covered for just a short period of time, it could be enough. Not for a minor escape, not for a single ship, but potentially for something much larger. American commanders continued to tighten their grip, convinced that they were closing in on a trapped and weakening enemy.
Every day that passed seemed to confirm their belief. The net was shrinking, the outcome felt inevitable. But what they didn't realize was that while they were watching the surface, something else might have been unfolding beneath it. And in a place where visibility could disappear in seconds, where entire fleets could hide in plain sight, and where certainty was always an illusion, even the strongest blockade in the world might not have been as unbreakable as it seemed.
It happened so quietly that at first, no one realized anything was wrong. By late July 1943, American forces were preparing for the next phase of the operation. All signs pointed toward a final confrontation. The Japanese garrison on Kiska was believed to still be there. Thousands of troops dug in, waiting. The naval blockade had been in place for weeks. Air patrols continued to sweep the area. From every available report, the enemy was trapped. Then, something changed. Reconnaissance flights began to return with strange observations. Pilots reported a lack of movement, no visible activity, no anti-aircraft fire, no signs of life where there should have been constant defensive readiness. At first, this was seen as a possible sign of weakness. Maybe the Japanese forces were running out of supplies. Maybe morale had collapsed. But the silence didn't feel right. Normally, even in harsh conditions, a defensive force would show some presence, smoke from fires, movement of equipment, something. Instead, there was nothing, just fog drifting across empty terrain. Still, the assumption remained. The enemy was there, hidden, waiting. American commanders moved forward with plans to land troops on the island. They expected resistance. They prepared for heavy fighting. Every soldier knew this would not be easy. The Japanese had a reputation for fierce defense, often fighting to the last man. But when the landing finally began in August 1943, something unbelievable happened. There was no resistance. Troops moved inland cautiously, expecting ambush at any moment. Every sound, every shadow in the fog felt like a threat. Guns were ready. Units advanced slowly, scanning for enemy positions. But as they pushed deeper into the island, the realization began to spread. The Japanese were gone. Not defeated, not surrendered. Gone. Over 5,000 troops, along with equipment, supplies, and weapons, had vanished without a trace. There were signs they had once been there: abandoned camps, empty fortifications, equipment left behind in haste. But no bodies, no prisoners, no clear indication of a battle or retreat under fire. It didn't make sense. The island had been under constant observation. The surrounding waters were patrolled. The skies were monitored. According to everything the Americans believed about their own blockade, there was no possible way for such a large force to escape undetected. And yet, they had. Confusion quickly turned into disbelief. How could thousands of soldiers simply disappear from an island surrounded by enemy forces? It wasn't just unlikely, it seemed impossible. Initial reactions ranged from suspicion to frustration. Some commanders believed the reports must be wrong. Others assumed that the Japanese were still hiding somewhere on the island, waiting for the right moment to strike. Patrols were sent out repeatedly to search every corner, every ridge, every bunker. Nothing. The island was empty. What made the situation even more unsettling was the complete lack of evidence pointing to how the evacuation had happened. There were no confirmed sightings of large transport ships, no recorded naval engagements, no intercepted communications that hinted at a coordinated withdrawal on such a massive scale. It was as if the entire force had slipped through the cracks of reality itself. For the soldiers on the ground, the experience was eerie. They had prepared for a brutal battle, only to find silence. Fog rolled over abandoned positions. Equipment lay scattered, untouched. It felt less like a victory
and more like walking into a place that had been quietly abandoned in the middle of the night. But even as the Americans tried to process what had happened, the bigger question remained unanswered. How? How do you move over 5,000 troops off an island surrounded by a naval blockade under constant aerial surveillance without being seen? It was a question that would linger long after the operation ended. Because whatever had happened in those final days before the landing, it wasn't just a simple retreat. It was something far more precise, far more calculated, and far more mysterious than anyone had anticipated.
Once the shock began to settle, the focus shifted to the only question that mattered. How did they do it? The idea that over 5,000 Japanese troops could simply vanish from Kiska without detection was almost impossible to accept. But the evidence was undeniable. The island was empty. No battle had taken place. No large-scale engagement had been recorded. Whatever happened, it had been executed with incredible precision. The first and most widely accepted explanation was a covert evacuation. Not a desperate escape, but a carefully planned operation carried out under the cover of darkness and, more importantly, under the protection of the Aleutians' unpredictable weather. The key factor was fog. In most parts of the world, fog is an inconvenience. In the Aleutians, it was a weapon. It could roll in suddenly, becoming so dense that visibility dropped to just a few meters. Ships could pass within close range of each other and never make contact. Aircraft flying overhead could see nothing but a solid wall of gray. Japanese commanders understood this better than anyone. They had spent months adapting to these conditions, learning how to move quietly, how to navigate with limited visibility, and how to use the environment to their advantage. According to reconstructed timelines, the evacuation likely took place during one of these heavy fog periods in late July 1943. Japanese naval forces, including destroyers and transport ships, approached the island at just the right moment when American visibility was at its worst. Timing was everything. If they moved too early, they risked being spotted. Too late, and the weather might clear. But in that narrow window, when fog covered both sea and sky, they had an opportunity, and they took it. The operation itself would have required near-perfect coordination. Troops had to be assembled quickly and quietly. Equipment had to be either loaded or abandoned without creating noise or delay. Ships had to move into position, load thousands of men, and withdraw, all without confusion, panic, or detection. In normal conditions, this would have been extremely difficult. Under a blockade, it should have been impossible. But this was not a normal situation. The fog didn't just hide movement, it disrupted American systems. Aerial patrols were grounded or rendered ineffective. Ships struggled to maintain visual contact with each other. Radar, still limited in capability, couldn't always distinguish between real targets and interference caused by weather and terrain. There were also signs that the Japanese may have used deception as part of their plan. Some historians suggest that they maintained the illusion of a continued presence on the island as long as possible, keeping fires burning, leaving equipment in place, and avoiding any sudden changes that might alert American observers. By the time the evacuation began, American forces may have already been convinced that nothing unusual was happening. Another critical factor was speed. Reports suggest that the entire evacuation may have been completed in a matter of hours. Ships moved in, loaded troops, and disappeared back into the fog before American forces had a chance to react. Even if there were brief sightings or suspicions, the window to respond would have been incredibly small. And then there's the possibility of simple human error. Blockades rely on constant vigilance, but in the harsh conditions of the Aleutians, maintaining perfect awareness was nearly impossible. Crews were exhausted, visibility was unreliable, communication gaps were common. All it would take was one overlooked moment, one sector not fully covered, one assumption that everything was under control. That might have been enough.
Some accounts even suggest that American forces did pick up unusual activity, unidentified signals, distant engine noises, but dismissed them as false alarms. In an environment where confusion was constant, distinguishing between real threats and natural interference was a daily challenge. When you combine all of these factors, perfect timing, environmental cover, disciplined execution, small gaps in enemy awareness, and even an element of sheer luck, the impossible starts to look possible. Not easy, not likely, but possible. Still, even with this explanation, there are details that remain unclear. The scale of the operation, the level of coordination required, the precision of naval movements, and the complete lack of direct confrontation raise questions that have never been fully answered. Some historians even speculate that intelligence miscalculations and overconfidence by American commanders played a role, creating the small margin of error that made such an audacious escape feasible. Because for something this large, this complex, and this risky to succeed so completely, it required more than just good planning. It required everything to go exactly right. And in war, that almost never happens.
Even after decades of research, the disappearance of the Japanese troops from Kiska remains one of World War II's most confounding mysteries. Historians, military analysts, and eyewitnesses have all tried to piece together what happened, but no single explanation fully accounts for it. Was it perfect planning, clever use of terrain, or just a remarkable stroke of luck? Perhaps it was all of these, and maybe something even more unusual. Some suggest it was a masterclass in military deception. Japanese commanders may have intentionally created the illusion of an entrenched force, leaving fires burning, equipment visible, and false tracks to mislead observers. Every delay, every shadow, every minor movement could have been part of a plan designed to convince the Americans that the garrison was still present. The island appeared occupied, even when it was effectively empty. Others focus on the human and environmental factors. The Aleutians were notorious for unpredictable weather, dense fog, violent storms, and freezing temperatures. Pilots and ship crews were exhausted, operating under extreme conditions where mistakes were inevitable. Even the most diligent blockade could be compromised if a single patrol lost contact or misread a signal. That small window might have been all the Japanese needed. Naval coordination played a crucial role as well. Reports indicate the Japanese transport ships and destroyers may have approached and departed the island under cover of night and fog with incredible precision. The timing had to be perfect. A few minutes too early or too late, and the operation would have been detected. It was a risky maneuver executed with a level of discipline and coordination that is almost unimaginable under wartime pressure. Some analysts go even further, raising questions about intelligence failures. Could the Americans have underestimated Japanese capabilities, misread the weather patterns, or over-relied on technology that was not suited for the environment? Radar was still limited, visual confirmation was unreliable in dense fog, and human error was almost inevitable. All these factors combined may have created the perfect conditions for an escape that seemed impossible. Then there are the more speculative theories. A few researchers have suggested extraordinary ideas, from secret tunnels to undiscovered landing craft hidden in coves, or even deliberate misinformation planted to confuse American observers. While there is no concrete evidence to support these claims, they illustrate just how baffling the event remains, even decades later. What is clear is that this episode left a profound mark on those involved. American forces who landed on Kiska expected heavy resistance and found none. The psychological impact was enormous. Soldiers prepared for one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific found themselves in an eerie silence, surrounded by abandoned equipment and empty bunkers. It was victory, yes, but also bewilderment, a reminder that in war, control is often more fragile than it seems. Modern historians generally agree that the most likely explanation combines all these elements: perfect timing, disciplined execution, clever deception, environmental cover, and small but critical gaps in American surveillance. Together, these factors made the impossible possible. Yet even this analysis cannot remove the sense of wonder. Moving thousands of troops undetected under constant threat in a war zone is a feat that defies expectation. The Aleutian evacuation challenges our understanding of military strategy, highlighting how factors like weather, human error, and deception can dramatically influence outcomes. It also reminds us that not every war story fits neatly into logic or conventional thinking. Some events, even in modern history, remain stubbornly mysterious, defying simple explanation. For decades, the world has speculated, theorized, and analyzed. The truth is partly known, partly hidden in the fog of history. And perhaps that is the enduring legacy of Kiska, a story of an audacious escape, an environment so extreme it could hide an entire army, and a reminder that even in the most calculated conflicts, unpredictability can change everything. No matter how much we study it, one question remains. How did 5,000 soldiers vanish without a trace, right under the eyes of the enemy? It is a question that may never be fully answered, and that is precisely why the story of Kiska continues to fascinate, intrigue, and haunt historians and military enthusiasts alike.